So, once upon a time, there was a teacher who stood at the front of the classroom holding a cup of coffee. I know. My teachers never had coffee either. I don't know where this story came from.
My teacher.
Yeah. So they looked at the stack of heavy books on their desk and said, I need both hands for this. Could someone hold my coffee for me? And a student jumped up and said, oh, I'll do it for you. And as the teacher walked past, they bumped the student's arm, and coffee spilled everywhere. This is why you don't have coffee in the classroom. I'm just saying. So the teacher turned to the student and said, why did you spill my coffee? Well, the student got really upset and said, well, because you bumped me. And then the teacher paused and smiled and said, that's not why the coffee spilled. It spilled because coffee was in the cup. I want to know where this teacher got their degree. I'm just saying. So the room got very quiet, and the teacher explained, if the cup had had tea, tea would have spilled. If it held water, water would have spilled. Whatever is inside the cup is what comes out when it's shaken. Then the teacher said, life is going to shake you. It'll bump into you when you're tired. It'll surprise you when you're stressed. It'll test you when things feel unfair. And when that happens, what spills out of you? Patience or anger? Kindness or harsh words? Gratitude or bitterness? Most of the time, we blame the bump. We blame the other person. We blame the situation. But the truth is this: the bump doesn't create what spills out. It only reveals what was already inside. So the real question isn't who bumped me, it's what am I carrying in my cup? Have I filled it with gratitude, honesty, kindness, or courage? With forgiveness, joy, gentleness, and love for others? The teacher lifted the cup and said, this is why it matters what we pour into ourselves, because what's inside doesn't always stay inside us. It spills into our families, our classrooms, our friendships, and our world. And when life shakes us, and it will, what spills out of us will always have an impact on others. So what's in your cup today? Me, I'm grateful to be here. I'm grateful I get to talk to you. So I want you to think about that when you go off to your class today, okay? Okay. Will you join me in the spirit of prayer and reflection? Spirit of life and love, it is so good to be together, especially in these days of uncertainty, when war has started, our citizens are dying overseas and in our streets. Let us hold on to each other and the warmth and love of this community. Let us remember that this fellowship is here to support and sustain us. Will you join me in meditation?
My task was to write about what a minister means to me and how that has changed over time. From age 3 to 5, I knew the minister at the church I attended with my parents. That was at Mount Diablo Unitarian Universalist Church in Walnut Creek, California. His name was Peter. I don't remember much about him except he had shoulder-length blonde hair, he was frequently smiling, he was very kind, and my parents really liked him. Unfortunately, my family stopped going to UU services when I was 5 and a half. After that, in my teenage and many of my adult years, my encounters with people in leadership roles in houses of faith were pastors and priests, either in Lutheran or Catholic churches. I found myself in these churches due to either my best friend in high school, who was Lutheran, or due to my first husband, who was Catholic. To be honest, I never truly felt drawn in by any of these pastors or priests. You could argue that since I had many conflicting feelings about Christianity, I probably had conflicting feelings about the pastors and priests affiliated with these churches. I think that's a sound argument. Maybe I didn't give them a fighting chance. Maybe I didn't fully engage with them since I thought of myself as a bit of an outsider or interloper. The first time I came to UUFRC service, it was February of 2020. Yes, we know where this is going. Reverend Gretchen Woods was heading up, acting as interim minister here. I was very intrigued by your church and this service and the minister, and it made me sad to think that a new person would have to be found to fill her shoes, because just by going by to one service, I really liked her. I thought she was good. Then, a month later, COVID lockdown happened and everything got weird. Somehow in the middle of that, UUFRC auditioned and voted on a new minister, Brian Ferguson. I remember joining those first few audition online services and marveling at this man's strength and determination. I was impressed at his ability to make online church and services work. For the first time in a long time, I felt a genuinely warm and inclusive feeling from a minister, and that being online, which was very strange. I realized that Brian was beginning to create community with all of us somehow, even though we were all scattered, joining Sunday service from all of our respective homes. I thought to myself, well, that's great that he can do that, but let's see how he does when we're all back in person. Then we all slowly started coming back in person, and I witnessed Reverend Brian working even harder to build connections and connect with people. He was chatting with people, not just at coffee hour, but whenever he could. He was giving out his email address. He was encouraging people to get in touch. He was seeing how he could help when needed. It was really lovely to see him rise to the occasion and grow in his role with UUFRC even more. Then in early December of 2022, my own personal world turned upside down. My dad unexpectedly died at the age of 76. It turns out he had an undiagnosed heart condition that unfortunately caused his heart to stop working when he was sick with the flu. My family and I were in shock, and we were sorely unprepared in many, many ways. The thing is, in the months before my dad's death, he had wanted to find a new house of worship. After many years of avoiding church altogether, he and my stepmom were finally ready to begin looking to find a new church, and they had just begun looking, and they had not yet found a place that felt like a good fit for them. My stepmom and I began discussing my dad's memorial service. Who would run it? We had very few prospects, and when I did research, all of them fell through. I was feeling very discouraged, but I couldn't stop asking myself, what about Reverend Brian? My dad and Reverend Brian had never met, and that gave me pause. It felt very weird. I knew that I liked Brian. I felt he would do a good job, but I was still unsure. I did know, however, that my dad always had had a love affair with Scotland, and I know he would have been so delighted to know that someone with such an awesome Scottish brogue would be heading up his service. Reverend Brian enthusiastically agreed to do the service for us right away. We began to exchange emails, and we had a few in-person meetings. I was immediately struck by how much Brian truly wanted to get to know my dad. He was genuinely interested in finding out who my dad was, what his interests were, and what made him unique. When the day of the memorial service came, I realized how happy and relieved I was that Reverend Brian was steering the boat for all of us. He treated the service and the subject of my father with such respect and true honor. He was so kind, and he had such a high regard for not just my father, but the whole process of the memorial service. Everyone who left that day, they left feeling good, feeling like Reverend Brian had brought them closer to my dad. In the 3 years since my dad died, when I think of the word minister and I reflect on what it means to me, the first person I think of is Reverend Brian. Of course, I think of all the usual duties that a minister has, the tasks that we are very used to experiencing in the daily life of a church. But I also think of someone who stepped in when my family desperately needed assistance. and agreed to help us in a very special and considerate way. I never expected to be forever tied to Reverend Brian that way, but now that I am on the other side of it, I am so glad that I am.
That voice, still and small, is really that call to ministry. At least that's the way I heard it. I got my first call to ministry when I was 16 years old. I was attending a weekend conference for high school Catholic girls. I can't tell you what happened at that retreat. It wasn't a Damascus Road moment, but I came home different. Even my mother noticed it. She said, "What happened to you at that retreat?" And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" She said, "You're so nice to your sister." Obviously, there was some miracle that happened there. I left the Catholic Church in my 20s when I became a feminist, and I didn't see anybody that looked like me in the pulpit. I started looking for something that would speak to me, that deeper urge to preach and to serve. In my early 30s, I went to a memorial service at a Unitarian Universalist church, and there was this dynamic, tiny woman in the pulpit. And I thought, what is this place? Who are these people? And I came back every Sunday, and that was 42 years ago. And here I am. The call to ministry kept coming up in my 40s. And I kept thinking, oh, no, I'm too busy. I'm getting married. I'm establishing a household with my husband. I don't have time for this. But it wouldn't let me go. And I was sitting in General Assembly when President Bill Sinkford got up and said, "Now is the time. It's not a more convenient time, but now is the time." And I burst into tears. This was it. Now, it took me another 10 years to get to seminary, but that's all water under the bridge. Seminary is only part of the journey. It's a wonderful, important part of the journey, and it's one where you are in discernment with all the people that you're going to school with and all of your professors. In fact, it used to be at the San Francisco Theological Seminary in San Anselmo, professors and students all lived on campus together. Now in separate housing, but they were always together to help each other, to discuss the deeper questions that ministry always brings up. That's the seminary journey. When you start, you also apply to the UUA to be an aspirant for ministry. And when you apply, you also have to have a congregation that will sponsor you. At the time, I was a member with my husband at the Napa congregation, and they knew me very well. I was the first DRE they'd ever had, and so they were very enthusiastic about my going to seminary. Now, the other steps while you're going to seminary is your internship, which you know about since I served here, but you also do a hospital or a hospice chaplaincy, and then you have a career assessment, which is a 2-day battery of psychological testing. After you finish that, you apply to be a candidate for ministry. Then you graduate. But that's not it. There's one more big step. You have to meet with the Ministerial Fellowshipping Committee of the UUA. It's made of ministers and lay leaders who will decide your fitness for ministry. My appointment is March 28th, so I hope you will all hold me that day and send me good energy. Now, in that meeting, it's an hour-and-a-half meeting, I start by lighting a chalice, have some chalice lighting words, and then I deliver a sermon. And because I wanted to practice, I'm going to practice on you today. Thank you for the thumbs up. I hope it's still thumbs up on March 29th. A few months ago, I was scrolling through TED Talks, looking for something interesting to watch. I happened to see a title of a talk called 500,000 Secrets. The speaker, Frank Warren, had invited people to anonymously share a secret they had never told anyone else by writing a postcard to him. He shared some of them with the audience. Now, most people had decorated their cards with clip art or stock photos or their own artwork, and that illustrated their secrets. Many of the ones he shared had to do with infidelity, admissions of sexual or financial abuse, admissions of crimes that people had committed. But one in particular stood out to me, and I kept thinking about it. The postcard showed a picture of New York's Twin Towers, and the secret was, everybody who knew me before 9/11 thinks I'm dead. Yeah, let's breathe that in for a moment. Everyone who knew me before 9/11 thinks I'm dead. This stopped me. I had to sit with it and try to put myself in that person's shoes. What must their life have been like to make that split decision? Did they miss being in one of those buildings when they were late to work that day because of traffic, some appointment, or because they needed to drive their child to school? Did they run out of the office to pick up breakfast or to meet a friend for coffee? Were they on their way back to work when they saw the first plane hit the tower? I could feel them standing on the sidewalk, looking up at the building where their office was, confused about what was happening and seeing the smoke pouring out of a floor beneath where they worked. Frozen in place, seeing first responders arrive and watching people pouring out of the building. Were they still standing there, unable to move, when the building started to fall, and the tide of people just pulled them along to a nearby cross street as the cloud of dust and toxic ash rose up and made them fall to the pavement? Grabbing their shirt and pulling it up over their nose and mouth so that they could breathe, it must have seemed that the world had exploded and that everyone in Lower Manhattan was going to die that day. I can only imagine that this could have been very disorienting and confusing. One minute it's a beautiful September day, blue skies and sunshine, and the next, it seemed as if hell had opened up and descended on the city. I can imagine that in the next several hours, when you realize that you survived this tragic event, that you would be glad to be alive and guilty at the same time. I've seen this with Vietnam veterans who couldn't understand why they were alive when their buddies were not. Because soldiers in that war forgot the overarching reason that they were moving through a foreign land killing people. All the government's reasons meant nothing to them. They were only there to protect the lives of the men and women they served with, their buddies. I can imagine that this person in New York wondered who was in their company had survived and who had been lost. Now, most people want to go home and be with their families. But like the men and women who have served in combat missions, there's a camaraderie that evolves with the people who share in a traumatic, life-altering event. You might think that no one at home would understand. But is that enough of a reason to just disappear? Once they got their bearings on that horrible day, when did it occur to them that they didn't have to go back? Was this the chance they didn't know they were looking for to create a new life? Did they realize that the tribe they'd been assigned to because of gender, sexual orientation, class, or ability no longer fit? I know that people can disappear. Today it's much harder than it was before computers and the ability of law enforcement to track missing persons by their credit card purchases and cell phones. When I read my ancestry family tree, I found that my grandmother's husband, who abandoned his wife, my mother, and her 3 siblings, later married again 2 states away about 10 years after he disappeared. And I can tell you that the effect of my grandfather disappearing had an enormous impact on my mother's life. She carried a deep-seated anger at her children for having a life she never got to have, spending 5 years in an orphanage. Years ago, I used to meet with a friend to write every Saturday morning, and we were sitting around tossing out ideas for our next project. Now, I was single at the time, and although my life was not difficult, except for the fact that I had little money, I had a lot of time to pursue working in the theater while holding down a part-time job. But still, there were times when I wished that I could just drive right out of my life and into something that might be better. And I knew that if I felt that way from time to time, that other people with far more responsibility than me could experience that feeling too. So I offered this scenario to my writing partner for our next project. A woman who's married with 2 young children, who feels as if she's given her life away, drops them off at school one morning on her way to work, and just keeps driving. Nothing in her life is awful. She's just tired and restless, and she wonders, where did she go? Where is the girl with all the dreams that set them aside when she got married, and her life became their life? She realizes that her relationship with her husband is strained due to their working schedules. And frankly, the division of labor around the house and the children just doesn't feel equitable, especially since she knows she needs to work to keep them all afloat, what with the mortgage, car payments, and the student loan debt. The children seem to want so much of her time and have less and less respect for her as they get older. The house never seems as clean and organized as it was before the children came. The bills were sometimes overwhelming, and her job was nowhere near the career she longed for and had now become day-to-day drudgery. The 2-week vacation she and her husband took every year never seemed to be enough time to reset and renew, and some years she just wished that her husband would take the children and let her stay home alone. The thought of that was heaven to her. My writing partner was stunned. Now understand, this man was a real feminist, and it showed in the way he treated women both in real life and on the page. He told me flatly, no woman would do that, leave their children and disappear. I told him that women or men may not do that, but most of them have thought about it. He didn't believe me. So I said, go to work this week and ask the people you know if they've ever thought about leaving. The next Saturday when we met, I asked him if he'd talked to anyone at work and what they said. He said, my God, Mary Ellen, it's an epidemic. Everybody's thought of it. So we think about it, but very few actually do it. So I asked Google why some people disappear from their lives. There were the standard answers about too many obligations, a brush with the law where they could be convicted, too much debt, or mental illness. This was not answering my question. You will probably not be surprised that most of the questions were about whether it was a crime to disappear and how to do it. Yeah. But back to our original person who disappeared after 9/11. How much do they regret not going back and dealing with the life they had before? Do they wish they had reestablished contact at some point and regret their decision on that awful day? Have they watched with some morbid curiosity the remembrance gathering on 9/11 in subsequent years? Do they watch their children year after year, reading their name at the annual ceremony and growing up without them, and wondering how much they missed by not being there for every birthday and holiday? Do they ultimately sigh and say to themselves that they are all better off without them? Have they gone to the 9/11 memorial and traced their fingers along their name, carved in the marble surrounding the footprint of the tower? Why don't we leave? Why don't we run at the first opportunity when life gets difficult and too much to deal with? I think it's because we are communal animals. We learned eons ago that gathering together in our tribes has helped us survive. Not only because it was safer from outside sources, but because we had a shared history and we're better together. Priya Parker, in her book, The Art of Gathering, How We Meet and Why It Matters, says that we gather for many reasons and that we, quote, spend our lives gathering first in our families, then in the neighborhood, schools and churches, and then in meetings, birthday parties, board meetings, class and family reunions, dinner parties, and funerals, unquote. And I'm convinced that all these are necessary to our survival. If they weren't, I don't think we would have scrambled to find ways for all of us to be together during the pandemic, even online. We need each other. It's as simple as that. Our churches are places where we can, as Parker says, quote, gather to celebrate, mourn, mark transitions. We gather to make decisions. We gather because we need each other. We gather to show strength. We gather to honor and acknowledge. We gather to welcome, and we gather to say goodbye. I would venture to say that people who know where they are, where they belong, are less likely to look for a way to escape their lives and look for ways to embrace and be embraced by their communities. This is why our churches are so important. In a world where disconnection is so common, our faith can ground us in our common values. In a group where everyone recognize us as part of their tribe. I know that I don't want to live without a grounding for my life and soul, a community. This Unitarian Universalist community is as important and necessary for my survival as the air I breathe. I wish that for everyone, and especially for that person that disappeared on 9/11 and who felt that their survival depended on leaving everything and everyone they knew behind. I wish for them and for all of us a beloved community that supports and encourages our spiritual growth. Our churches, fellowships, and societies can and do provide this. But most of all, may we all know where we belong and who and whose we are, because we need each other, and there is nothing wrong with that. Amen.